It's Lone Survivor on Limited Run, the complete run. Coming in at the very end of the 2016 schedule, we have Limited Run Games' first proper entry in survival horror. While several of the releases we've seen to this point have contained elements of the genre, stealth, item rationing, stamina drain, Lone Survivor is a full-fledged entry in the format. This is a slow-paced and incredibly tense experience, and it hews to classic horror game stylings more than to contemporary themes and trends. Lone Survivor is short on jump scares and gimmicks, and instead focuses on atmosphere. Most of the game takes place inside a single apartment building. Think Silent Hill 4: The Room, where the protagonist lives alone. If you can actually call his state of existence living, that is. The monsters that lurk in the hallways of the building can easily take down your solitary protagonist, but most of them are easy to slip past or gun down, though of course you can't just fire indiscriminately. This is a survival horror game after all, which means that even once you acquire a gun, you need to keep careful track of your limited ammo. Lone Survivor takes a very different tack from most horror and survival games. It's a strictly single-player experience, having originally debuted for PC back in 2012, meaning it predates Rust's template for modern survival adventures by a year or so. It's also presented entirely with 2D, sprite-based graphics in a two-dimensional side-scrolling format, which is something you almost never see in this genre. It plays a little bit like Resident Evil in some respects, but there's also a strong hint of classic LucasArts Scum Engine games like Monkey Island and Maniac Mansion, a connection the game obliquely acknowledges by placing a large potted plant named Chuck in the hall outside your apartment. Perhaps unintentionally, Lone Survivor harkens back to the very earliest days of survival horror. Landmark titles, 8 and 16-bit import games like Sweet Home, Kamaitachi no Yoru, the original Clock Tower, or the original version of Corpse Party. Before 3D environments and voice acting were standard features in games, these older titles attempted to create a sensation of horror by surrounding players with a foreboding atmosphere or demanding they navigate an unsettling storyline. Lone Survivor embraces this old-school philosophy to its fullest. It's a brooding story that leaves you questioning your on-screen avatar's sanity at the best of times and the very nature of the in-game reality at the worst. Lone Survivor is also a game that resonates a lot more in 2020 than it did when it first debuted. The game opens with a close-up of your unnamed protagonist, a man wearing a medical face mask who has spent an unknown amount of time cooped up in his home to hide from the results of a pandemic. That includes seemingly infected creatures and, in the streets below, chaos and unrest. The longer he shelters alone, seeking direction and fragmented broadcasts and scraps of communications with others that he manages to come across, the more tenuous his grip on sanity appears to become. One sympathizes. There's a second layer to Lone Survivor's title, as the game was created almost single-handedly by Jasper Byrne, a British developer whose work stretched back to the 1990s, when he helped code and design several Amiga games, including the third entry in the Jet Set Willy series. Byrne's CV includes projects as massive as Microsoft's Kinectimals, but Lone Survivor was a more solitary pursuit, one that Byrne continues to plug away at. The limited run release for PlayStation and Vita was a revamped version of the original game called Lone Survivor Director's Cut, which added alternate endings and outcomes to the scenario. And Byrne is currently working on a comprehensive remake called Super Lone Survivor, which promises to contain an all-new additional scenario. It's very much a personal passion project for its creator. That personal connection shows clearly throughout the game. Lone Survivor takes a bold approach to survival horror gameplay by creating such a limited, claustrophobic world. The entire first half of the game takes place in a set of abandoned apartments on a second floor of a single building, with the player's overarching initial objective simply being to locate a key that will allow them to unlock the door to the fire escape and reach the ground level. Each foray out of the main character's room is limited by his stamina, both physical and emotional. Moving around the building wears him down physically, while the horror he encounters take a toll on his mind. In order to advance, you need to manage these personal factors while avoiding deadly monsters, finding ways to open locked doors and bypass barriers, and maintain contact with the outside world. Although Lone Survivor's 2D design and bitmapped-based graphics would suggest a dated-looking game, Byrne put HD-era post-processing effects to great use to give Lone Survivor a look and vibe that would have been impossible on an actual vintage console. By default, the apartment complex and surrounding world are wreathed in darkness that can only be pushed back with your flashlight, which naturally has a limited battery supply. But this darkness isn't simply a layer of black pasted atop the regular graphics. There's a grittiness to the dark that at first appears to be a film grain filter, but as the adventure unfolds, the scratches and marks take on new forms and new textures that underscore the underlying question of the main character's sanity. Namely, does it exist? Lone Survivor doesn't take a straightforward approach to telling its story. There's no external narrator. That task falls to the main character. The problem is that the main character doesn't seem especially sure of himself, even his own name, and he can't seem to remember basic details about fairly important things, like how this world-ending zombie apocalypse began in the first place. While you interact with other people throughout the game, those encounters never feel fully rooted in reality. They're often bookended by the visual interface going haywire, or the protagonist waking up in his bed the next day, disoriented and unsettled. On top of that, the fragmentary texts you acquire along the way, which would help provide clarity into the world and your objectives in any other game, only serve to muddle and mystify here. The protagonist keeps a diary by their bedside that keeps track of key events, but you'll also find random diary pages scattered around the world. These are often written by someone named Draco, who advocates a dog-eat-dog approach to getting by in the world. But who is Draco? Is it actually the player's character? Has the player's character lost his mind? In many ways, Lone Survivor hits hard because it leans so heavily into the unreliable narrator concept. The moment you acquire a handgun from a friend at a party, the world suddenly changes and you find yourself standing beside the seemingly long-dead bodies of the partygoers. Did you merely hallucinate speaking to them moments before? Did you somehow black out and return to their apartment days later? Or were you the one who killed them? The game constantly places you in these uncertain situations, keeping you perpetually off balance. Even more disturbing is the way the concept of the unreliable narrator seeps beyond the narrative and into the gameplay mechanics. The apartment building's layout may change over time. You may encounter strange beings who offer you cryptic hints. You can find drugs whose use is never properly explained. Letting your physical stamina run down is, in some respects, less of a threat to you than mental exhaustion, which can result in the more unpredictable twists. Suffer a breakdown, and you may wake up back in bed, possibly finding yourself in possession of items and objects you can't account for. Lone Survivor largely avoids making its interface too video gamey. There are no status meters to track your well-being. The screen takes on a red tint when you suffer critical physical damage, but your mental state is only really hinted at by the clarity or severity of the screen overlay effect. It seems like talking to your stuffed cat or tending to chuck the plant can help calm you, but it's hard to say for certain. Really, nothing is certain in Lone Survivor, not even the deadly monsters that roam the halls. Are they really zombies, or has the protagonist lost his mind, seeing other humans as grotesque creatures to be evaded or destroyed? Why do the partygoers seem so unconcerned about the apocalypse that appears to have devastated the world beyond the walls of the apartment complex? Are the bizarre, throbbing, organic-looking apertures that offer hidden connections between portions of the building some sort of living organism, or are they just a delusion? And when you teleport between locations by gazing into a mirror, are you really traveling instantaneously, or is that just your character's brain short-circuiting? It's an eerie, mind-bending game that ultimately offers very little in the way of real conflict. You can sneak around most of the creepy zombie guys by slipping into hiding spaces or luring them with rotten meat, but it's long on tension. Even as you deal with dwindling food and battery supplies, you're forced to navigate the question of how you interact with the world. Your choices have material impact on your mental well-being, and the more violently you choose to behave, the more fractured your mind and worldview become. There's only so much that talking to a stuffed cat can do for your brain's health, unfortunately. Your choices and behavior also affect the ultimate outcome of the game. It's not simply enough to survive. What's the point of living if you don't live well? Lone Survivor is meant to be replayed to seek different and better outcomes, though the requirements and path for earning the best ending are as oblique and unexplained as everything else about the game. Limited Run released the PlayStation 4 version of Lone Survivor Director's Cut as Catalog Number 30, with the Vita release shipping simultaneously as Catalog Number 31. Both games were also available in special bundles alongside the soundtrack CD, which was pressed in a highly limited allocation of only 600 copies.